Well, look at you all. I have been lost. I couldn't find you. And obviously you couldn't find me either, right? Lord have mercy at the challenges that we Hey, Liz. Hey, Carl. Hey, Jonathan. Hey, it's good. It's a good thing I answered Lynn's text. I thought, where is everybody? And I went through the same process. Don't know what happened. So now we got the fun of trying to get the forms up, right? No. Don't you just love technology? I do. Not. No, I do really. Oh, Carla, look at that new hairdo. I know you don't have a mic. I know.
Do you see? You hear me?
Oh, look at you. I can hear you now.
I'm using my phone instead of the computer.
Okay. Well, I tell you what, if you can't do it one way, you do another, right?
Yes, yeah.
We're trying to make sure that we find workarounds, that's for sure.
Yes, that's right.
I'm glad you're here. Well, today we're going to be talking about North Carolina buyer forms. We're all into that right now. If you're like a lot of the agents out there, you're going to be writing a lot of offers for buyers because we're still in that multiple offer situation, but not quite as deep as we've been for several months now. So let's see now if I can not lose you. Y'all hang in there, okay? I'm going to see if let's see.
Now we can't hear you. There you go. Oh,
we got the forms up though.
Got the forms up, but no audio.
It's back.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can.
Can you hear me now? How many years have we had? How many years have we been saying that statement? Can you hear me now? Well, you all are troopers, I tell you. It takes a team to get this job done, and you all are a good team. Oh, love. Well, as Jonathan, and I'm sure you've already realized that Miss Carla is the head of the compliance department here, and she's the one that she's the one that really keeps you all in line. So we kind of work together, but she's the one that keeps you in line.
Well, I haven't had any reprimanding yet, so.
Oh, good. Well, your turn's coming, I'm sure.
I'm on her radar now.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, she watches y'all that come on these classes, and that way she knows to watch and make sure you're doing it right.
That's right. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, right?
Yeah. Yep. That's it. That's right. Yeah. She does. She is one of the exception ones. I got to tell you, she finds things that very few people can find. I think, my gosh, how did you see that? What was I looking at yesterday? You'd missed one little check box in 15 pages, and I thought, go Carla. She definitely has the eye for it. So
she probably has that clear overlay that shows exactly what boxes should be checked.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea.
Oh, I was getting ready to say that. Sounds like a good idea. We might have to put Jonathan in the compliance.
I've been in compliance for a long time, so.
You're kidding. Yeah. Well, no wonder he has some tricks up his sleeve.
Yeah.
Well, let's see what we can get into today. This is kind of an in-house checklist. We have so many checklists, but any checklist that you can find helpful to you. Like I said, we have different formats, we have different patterns, we have a different focus on the checklist. And as you are working through some of your transactions, you will settle into one that's comfortable to you. Right now, a lot of the agents strictly are just using the one in command, because obviously it's right there when you're putting your documents in, and you can't get any better. But at the same token, some folks would prefer to have a paper copy, and this is a paper copy that you can print out. There's 2 or 3 other checklists as well that you can print out. And if anything is confusing on you and in the checklist, Carla's name and mine, and so we'll help you the best way we can. But last week, we were kind of talking about the listing appointments. Remember, and I told you there was a two-step process that had been very effective through the years. Same thing with your buyers. I can't tell you how important it is for you to have a buyer consultation. If you have that initial consultation with your buyers, it's going to help so much. It helps prepare the way and set expectations and builds trust, really, that they know what you're doing. So some of these forms are for you to know what you're doing and what the next steps are. This form is one of those forms just for you. You would not be sharing that with a buyer. However, we're going to look at some other forms that you will share with the buyer, and you might have already guessed what some of them are. Let me go back to this form just a moment. Remember this little section that we looked at before. This is within 3 days. We are really supposed to be turning in all of our documents. There are times that we don't get them in, but by law, when the buyer or the seller signs some documents, we're to put them in command. All right. That doesn't mean we submit them to Carla yet, but we put them in command so that if we needed to get to them, we could. So just keep in mind that when you're working with a buyer, you're going to obviously use your working with real estate agents disclosure, and you may give them the brochure. We were talking about that last week, but you definitely want to have the disclosure. And then you want to have your buyer agency agreement, because that's your employment agreement, and your offer to purchase. Now, once you get these taken care of and signed, these you would turn back in and submit to review. Yes, sir.
Hey, is it possible that you could zoom in on that document a little bit more?
You think I can do that? Look at that. Look at that.
I was gonna say keep going just a little bit more.
Okay. Is that
Perfect.
better?
That's good. That's much better.
Good suggestion. And isn't it amazing? I actually was able to do it. I mean, I want to pat on the back for that. You do know that.
A quicker option is you can hold the control button and wheel up with your mouse.
Oh, right. Well, we might have to do that as we're going down.
Makes it quick to adjust things on the fly.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. You did great.
Well, let me tell you something. Right now, we're just going to get it done. Okay. Now those 3 documents that I just mentioned, those are the 3 that you want to then submit for review. You don't have to submit the first 2, but put them in there. And then once you get the offer to purchase signed and all the documents that go with it, you want to submit for review, because Carla's not going to review it until you've actually got a contract. Okay. But the state says we have to have access to them. Okay. That you're going to have different types of contracts. Sometimes buyers come in different flavors. We typically work with a resale buyer or buyer of a resale home. Those are the forms we often find the most comfortable to use. Then you're going to sometimes have a contract that you will have from a builder. Most builders have their own contracts. They obviously are weighted toward the advantage of the builder. Can you imagine that? But their attorneys draft their forms. So when you are working with a client in new construction, you most often are going to go into a sales model. The sales rep for the builder is going to have all the documentation that you need as far as the sales contract. But you still need these 2 things here. This is where the builder comes into play. They will have their own forms that you'll have to sign, but these 2, you're working with real estate agents and your buyer's agency agreement, you need to have in place when you go to a sales center with a client. Then if you have the builder's contract, obviously that is the contract that you're going to upload into Command and then submit for review. You may or may not have it immediately, because when you're working with a builder, that contract obviously has to go through the corporate change, and the sales rep that's right there helping the buyer write it is not going to be the one that actually signs off on it. So just know that sometimes you won't get that immediately. There are times that you won't get, you might not even get the contract for several days, but once you do get it, when it's submitted to you, then you submit it for review. Now, there are some addendums that will come with this offer to purchase. And one of them might be what's called an REO addendum. That's real estate owned by a bank. That might be a foreclosure addendum. You're going to have something called a relo addendum. Relocation is a really big business in our country. We have quite a bit of relo business ourselves. So you might have an addendum or several addenda that are going to be attached to your offer to purchase, because again, it's written from the relocation company and the relocation client's perspective advantage. So you want to be real careful to read those relocation addendums. The addenda that the relocation company produces or advises attaching, you can't do anything about changing them. Okay, they're going to be pretty rigid on it. So that's why you got to make sure how many days they have for a due diligence. They don't call it due diligence, and they call it an inspection period. How many days have to be that it has, all the documentation has to go to the relocation company. There are quite a few differences when you look at the addendum or addenda, depending on it. Many times they do not have a residential property disclosure that was done by the client. So, but they will give you inspection reports. They will give you their version of it, although they're not the seller at that particular time. So if you get a relocation client, it's going to be a little different. Just talk to us about it, and we can kind of help guide you through it. We're not going to spend too much time on that because we don't see that many of them right now. Any addendum that is offered with the offer to purchase, make sure it's an attorney drafted addendum. North Carolina and South Carolina are very strict on us not practicing law without a law degree. Boy, I wish to goodness I'd gone to law school years ago, but nevertheless, we have good attorneys, and we need to be conscientious about adding attorney drafted addendum. All right. And when you I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time on this, but just realize that when you're going down this side, this is really kind of the order of the forms that you're going to use. You know, you're going to basically, once you get your offer to purchase, you're going to have your residential property disclosure. You're going to have your MOG. That's what is down in here. You're going to obviously have the receipt of monies. If you have a due diligence fee, you're going to get a receipt. If that's, you sign it, if it's delivered to you or your client, you want the clients to sign it. We'll talk about that just a little bit more as I get into the offer to purchase. But I'm basically kind of showing you the progression of forms that you need to work through. You will not have every single one of these forms. You'll have a lot of them, but I put an assortment on there so that you know to look for the other one in case you don't have it. So just be aware that not all of them, but most of them you will have need to use them. Okay. Over here, I put it as a hint, 3 days before closing, make sure that everything's in there, because if you're not, your check gets held up, because we've got to make sure you're compliant. All right. And we're not too demanding on some things, but we do have our standard of demand. And so just make sure to get it in, get all the paperwork in, and then you can get paid very timely. Lynn's very good at getting checks out of there once you've got everything submitted. Sometimes we have terminations. I don't like terminations, but you know what? We have to deal with them. And we'll probably have a whole class in the end of the month on just terminations. So that is one of our forms. You will notice on the forms that we have a form number on the checklist. We have a form number. We have the date that it's copyrighted. Most North Carolina forms are copyrighted. They're changed every July 1. They're changed, so we get introduced to them in June. As of July 1, We have new forms, not necessarily every form, but we have updates or new forms entirely on July 1 each year. They very, very rarely ever introduce a form throughout the year. We did during COVID, we had a couple of ones. So just realize those forms, any North Carolina form is most likely going to have the date of 7/2022. Okay. So let's scoot on down here now. We have in our office, we have joint ventures. And one of the joint ventures that we have is with a title company. It's called Heritage Title. Heritage Title, and some of the agents and owners are involved in a joint venture. Therefore, RESPA requires that we disclose to our clients that we do have title insurance and we can offer them title insurance. The important thing when you're disclosing this, obviously this is your disclosure, and you're going to want to have one of these on hand when you're talking to your buyers, or talk to your buyers and then send it to them to electronically sign. You can do either one. Heritage Title is actually like a subsidiary or a department of Investors Title. And you're probably very familiar with the term Investors Title if you've been around real estate at all. Investors has been around many, many years. And so that's another reason why we feel real good about our title company. Title companies offer title insurance. They offer renewal rates as well as initial rates. The state of North Carolina regulates the initial rates. So no title company can offer a different initial rate. There are times when you can get something called a renewal rate, and it's almost 50% of what the cost of the initial rate. So the attorney is going to they're going to check this out. And the attorney, when the attorney detects the former policy, the amount of money that was borrowed on it, then not borrowed, insured on it, then that half of that is probably what the initial rate would be for your buyer. So just kind of be aware that title insurance is something that the attorney is the one who orders it. The attorney is the one who gives you descriptions of it and advises you. Okay. All we have to do is to disclose that we have this title company, and we would like to offer them the services of our title company. Right here is their choice, basically, where they're going to choose to request our title policy through Heritage. And they're actually asking the attorney to use our title policy. If they have no other policy that they are aware of or want to use, give our company a chance. All right. And then right here is a line where they're going to select the closing attorney. Now, we have a form called a professional services disclosure and election. When you're talking to them about the different services that they're going to use, one of them is going to be the title service. And the other one would be the closing attorney. The closing attorney is the one who does all the calculations on their closing statement along with the lender and tells them what they're going to owe when they go to closing. And the attorney is the one who does all the title work. So again, we're not directing people, but we certainly are available to recommend some attorneys that we use and that we're comfortable with using. I just don't think you can get any better than John Clemens with McNaughton Clemens. I mean, he has just been such a help to most of our agents. We have a number of other closing attorneys, and I'll be glad to give you a list. Just as I'm saying, I'll be glad to give you a list. You can say to your buyer, you'll be glad to provide 3 or 4 names of people, that we would recommend because we have agents that recommend them. All right. Or if you've personally used one, that's a good way to recommend. So that's where, when you're talking to them about the closing attorney, obviously you're going to put the name of the closing attorney here. The important thing about this is not so much that they make the choice as much as it is that you disclose. Okay. And you want to get the buyer's signature here, and then you are going to sign it right here. Now, I got to warn you, I'm right in the process of updating this one, so don't get too hung up on this form because it's in the process of being changed. It's an in-house form. It's not like the North Carolina forms that only change July. Again, this is your disclosure that tells exactly what North Carolina will allow a title company to charge on their initial title insurance. So you know this is what's going to be charged by any title company, unless you can get that renewal rate, which is really always to the advantage of your buyer. Another thing with title insurance, keep in mind is, you know, there are a lot of people who are putting sizable amounts of money. Either they're buying cash or they're putting a bucket full of money down and maybe getting small loans on the property. Don't ever forget to remind a buyer that they need to have title insurance on their portion of the value of the property. If there's a lender involved, the lender's only concerned with the amount they've got invested in the property. You know, that's the lender's title coverage, but you want to make sure, particularly when they're coming in with, like someone the other day, they're putting down $1 million and they're going to finance another $500,000. You know, so if I got $100 million, and I want to make sure that it's covered by title insurance. So again, that's just a sidebar for you to be aware of. Okay. Now,
Saber,
last week,
is that the same even on like lower value, deposits, like 20%, let's say?
I would personally, it's because after all, 20% on $600,000 property,
Yeah.
or 400,
Yeah.
maybe if it's $120,000 property, I might not get too too serious about recommending it. But on many of the properties that you'll be seeing right now, because the prices are so high, just be aware, and anywhere from that 20% down, maybe. Okay. Now, good question though. Last week, we spent considerable time on the residential property disclosure. So I'm not going to spend a great deal of time, but what I wanted to remind you of, when you start to write an offer, you want to make sure that you have the residential property disclosure in the MOG. All right. Remember, I told you one of my very favorite things of all is that that listing agents now can attach them to the MLS listing. I love that because I have spent many years tracking down listing agents to try to track down a residential property disclosure. And it's like, that's wasted time and energy. So now they are attached to your listing agreement your listing in Canopy MLS. So you just print it out. That's one of those first things I kind of like to have, is to be able to get it in the hands of the buyer. And the reason it's critical to have it in the hands of the buyer before or as you are writing the offer to purchase is that they have a right to cancel the contract. It's like a 3-day right of rescission. I think we mentioned that. So just make sure that you get that residential property disclosure, and it should already have the owner's signature on it right here. And then what your buyer is going to do is, once they have a chance to review it, and I don't mean in detail, I mean the fact that they've got it and they can look over and see that they've got it, then that's when you would want to make sure that they would sign it at the time you're writing your offer. One of the things that Carla and I have to keep in mind is, look right here at the top, that address right there. You'd be surprised how many times people forget to put the address. You know, that front page could get lost and get attached to another address. So just make sure that you get those two, the property address up there. Again, I'm so tempted to go into discussing this, but I'm not going to. Carla knows me. I just have a hard time not going into details on so many of these things. I'm going to try to be good. I am going to have to go into detail on one of them though. Look at here. On the number 24, I believe we talked a little bit about this last week about let's see, where is it? What's the word? I'm looking for building permits. I'm over there, building codes, but I'm looking for building permits. Where is it? Where's that word? Do you see it?
No.
What happened to our word of building permits? Oh my gosh. How dare they change that? How dare they?
Building code, that's what I say.
That's what I see too. That building, that has been in there forever. Well, let me tell you why I wanted to point it out to you. We are under a barrage of complaints. I shouldn't say we, the commission is, although it's coming back on us now because the commission is getting so many complaints of sellers, owners, contractors not getting building permits. Building permits have not been top priority. It's something, if you see an addition, you see a deck, you see a finished garage, finished basement, finished, or maybe a deck, or like I say, a finished sunroom. You always want to ask, you start nicely and say, did you do the work yourself, or were you able, did you hire a contractor? Again, not accusing, but stay in curiosity, because you want to find out who the contractor is. You want to find out, preferably, you'd like to see a receipt for the work being done. Main thing is you want to see that somebody did it beside the owner. All right. So building permits, that's been about the extent of what we've done, a lot of building permits. But the last 3 months, I've got to tell you, they at the commission are coming down really, really hard on building permits, and whether the person who did the work was licensed or whether they had a right to. And again, we're gonna have to work out a whole class on this, because it's really getting hairy out there, and we don't want any of you all getting those letters from the real estate commission. But be conscious of the need for a building permit for almost everything that needs to be done in the home. Owners sometimes can do work on their homes that would require a permit for a contractor to do. But if the owner is not planning to live there an extended time, at least a year, they are not considered as an owner. They are possibly what we call flippers. They may have gone in to restore a house or to remodel a house. And so, like I said, there's some real issues going on, and we'll spend a little bit more time, but I got to find that I gotta find that provision. And I cannot believe, I see it now. I see it again. It's called proper permits. It's not called building permits. No, I was getting really, I thought I was losing my mind there. I've been looking at this for 20 years. So, including the failure to obtain proper permits. Okay. And again, we'll spend some more time, but now you're really conscious of number 24, right?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, John.
You were saying about the flipper and the 1-year term of like somebody doing their own work. Is there a what's the word I'm looking for? Say someone does do their own work and they typically require a permit. Is there a limitation on time that that permit wouldn't become required anymore?
A lot of it depends on the county. Okay. And I hate to answer it that way, but a lot of it depends on the county. And so if whatever county the work is being done in, that person, whether it's the owner or a handyman or a contractor, really do need to call the county and get their specifications on that. There are some counties that that will let you get by really with a permit in 3 months, you know, if with a permit, but the length of time that you could do it as an owner and get by without a permit. Is that the question you're asking me?
That is like say that you have someone who's selling a house and there was an addition put on, but the addition didn't have permits pulled. And let's just say that it was done 3 years prior. You know, is there like a
you
time
probably
limit?
would be just fine with that. Recently, I was on a webinar on this, and they used the term 1 year because they're thinking that if somebody was going to live there for a year, they were really doing it for themselves, and an owner has a right to do it for themselves.
Okay.
An owner just doesn't have a right to do it and then sell it to somebody else.
Is that that's including electrical and like plumbing and stuff like that?
But the recommendation is that the owner always hire a licensed professional.
Right.
And say we really haven't had a lot of stress on that in the years past, to be honest with you. There are a lot of people who have real good awareness of how to treat things with electrical or the plumbing things, particularly
Right.
things like changing a toilet or some of the things. I mean, all they're doing is replacing, but they're clamping down on some of these. So, but we'll look at it a little bit more closely. But I would say if you have any doubt, pick up the phone. You don't have to identify yourself.
Right.
You pick up the phone and ask. As an agent, and that's what they were telling us as buyer's agents. Buyer's agents really do need to pick up the phone. Don't rely on the listing agent. And we're thinking, well, why should the listing agent pick up the phone? They should, but what if they didn't? You know,
Right.
we had a
Exactly.
situation where the listing agent said, well, there's been no work done on this house. Everything's cosmetic. Wrong. It wasn't. And so now we've got an issue on it. But anyway, just to kind of be aware, and if you have any question whatsoever, let's verify that and just call the not zoning, building codes department.
Okay.
All right, good question. Okay, like I said, every one of these we could camp out on as we did last week. Okay, so I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time on it. And we talked about the possibility of the two owners HOAs. Remember, you want to make sure that you know if there's more than one HOA and find out information about the HOA. Okay, let's scooch on down here. Here's your MOG. That's that mandatory form that everybody has to have except foreclosures, estate, and a family member. New construction does require the MOG, but not the residential property disclosure. Okay. Now let's get on down here. Now we're down to the good stuff. Okay. We're going to write an offer to purchase. When you're getting,
Oh no, I'm just saying, yay, offer to purchase.
okay. Yeah, we're getting the good stuff now. The offer to purchase is initially an offer. And obviously that's the reason the title says and contract. When does it become a contract?
Until the person signs.
When
It's delivered.
everybody has signed, yeah. And
Delivered.
initialed any changes. So it was everybody signed. And if there's been any counters, then you're going to mark through that and initial that, and always date those initials. Okay. And you can, in your e-signature programs, you are able to add initials, or you certainly are able to do it, manually, not manly, manually. Okay. The terms of this offer would be as follows. The seller, and if you remember last week when we were talking about listing agreements, the seller sometimes is not an individual. Sometimes the seller might be an LLC, might be a corporation, more likely than LLC. It could be a trust. It could be an estate. Remember when we were kind of going through that a little bit last week? Then make sure that you have the name of the seller. Now, let me tell you 2 or 3 places that you might find it, and don't leave that blank, okay? You can find the seller's name in the tax records. And if I were you, I would always pull the tax records, the MLS sheet, the residential property disclosure, and the MOG. I would have those 4 documents in my hand when I'm writing this offer, all right? So if for chance, the name on the tax records might be different from the name on the residential property disclosure, you need to find out why they don't match. The residential property disclosure, remember we looked at it a little bit ago. They said the owner signature has the owner's signature in addition to property address. See, that's the second place that you generally check the name of the seller. So you have at least 2 places. Most of us don't put the seller's name in the MLS listing itself. Some agents might put the last name, but we typically do not put the name. But those are the tax records and the residential property disclosure would be the 2 sources to find the name. And if they don't match, you want to call the listing agent to find out why. sometimes, particularly if it's an estate, that might be showing different. But the main thing is you want to constantly be cross-referencing. You're constantly verifying information that you've been given, and you want to check out that second source. All right. So, and obviously, you know your buyer's name. Yes, sir.
What were the 4 documents? I have tax records, residential property disclosure, mineral oil and gas rights, and then what was the 4th one?
The MLS listing.
MLS.
Thank you.
Yeah. Like I say, typically you don't have that. The thing you're going to find the difference on the MLS listing is going to be the address. A lot of times the tax records are going to be different from the property address the seller gives you. And that, remember, we're talking about that often is because of the postal service. They often will give you a different address. And so, but the name you don't see as much unless it might be an estate. You know, it maybe the person is recently passed or has just passed, and you might see a difference in there. So just talk with your listing agent and find out that. Now, when you come on down here, see this little note right here. This is new in this particular version of the offer to purchase. The property shall include all the real estate described below, but then here it says the property will or will not include a manufactured or mobile home. Obviously, we do have quite a few mobile homes in our state. And I thought when I left Florida, I didn't have so many mobile homes, but you'd be surprised how many we have in North Carolina. So they have actually included this as part of the offer. So it does or it does not have a mobile home. It's very important that if it does have a mobile home, whether that's the main residence or if it's a secondary residence, sometimes it is, you want to make sure to know the VIN, VIN, vehicle identification number, because if it has a VIN number that's active with the Motor Vehicles Department in North Carolina, it is like a car. You can't sell it. It's not a residence if it has a VIN number that has not been detitled and get a deed for that. So selling a mobile home, not modular, the word mobile or manufactured, look for those words. Those are the 2 words that you need to find out if it has a VIN number that has not been detitled. Like a car, the VIN number says that's the identification number, and the Department of Motor Vehicles is the one that you need to check that out with. And as it tells you right here, the additional provisions addendum, that is an addendum that's in our library of forms, and there's your number of it right there, that would need to be included with the offer to purchase if there is a mobile home on the property. Okay. And it explains a lot of things I was just talking about the VIN. I mentioned to you about the street address. Make sure that you're selling the right property. Okay. I promise you, I cannot believe how many stories will come up about 2 hours before I do a class. Would you believe just a little while ago, I got this email from one of our agents, and that the lender wants the address changed from Wesley Chapel to, I think they said Indian Trail, but it's all within the same zip code. It's around that 28104. It's Union County, but they want the address changed. It's like, okay, how do I change the address? We're supposed to close in 3 days. And that is one of the things you can do on what we call an addendum A. It's one of the in-house forms. You cannot write on addendum A anything that would say, if this, then that. If it's if this, then that, the attorney has to write it. You may put on an addendum A simple statement, address to be corrected as follows, and write the new address. That's all that the lender would want. But remember, the addendum A is only for a statement of correction. Do not ever put if this, then that. Okay. When you are doing your legal description, again, I think we talked about that earlier. We do not do plat references. All right. We only do deed references. So when you are looking up the information on your tax records, You are going to be looking for a deed booking page. You are also going to be looking for a legal description, which you're going to put in right here. This whole paragraph is really titled legal description, but we want you to write the entire legal description here, which normally starts with an L, like lot, so make sure you put the legal description here that you find in your MLS listing and or verified. It's the same in your tax records, okay? Your PID, that's your property ID, and it's going to go right here. If you're looking at the MLS listing in Canopy, up in the right-hand column, there is a hyperlink, the blue line underneath it. You're going to give hyperlink and you go right to the tax records right there. That's your PID. That's your property ID. So that's the number that's going to go in right here. Nothing is going to go in here I think we talked about last week, whether you should put NA or 0 or what. And I said, just put a couple of dashes, anything that keeps you from writing something in there. And then of course, here's your subdivision. Now let's talk about this section right here. This is a biggie. This is where we're going to decide how much we're going to offer on this property. You're going to do a CMA for a buyer, just like you would if you were listing the property. You want to make sure that you are going to have, if nothing more than the quick CMA that you can do in MLS, at least have that as you're talking. I would imagine, unless this is just something that the buyer is wanting to do very quickly, they saw this house come on the market and they're afraid it's going to be gone next week. It would be very, most of the time you're going to have enough time to look up and do a little bit better CMA, but you want to be serious about helping them price, to look at a price. Sometimes they're not going to pay attention to you, but you are going to have your paper trail that you did look at pricing. Okay. I'm not going to talk about the purchase price anymore because that's totally going to be up to the buyer. Let's talk about processes. The process is going to have to happen right now. Once you
Did she freeze?
You're cutting out, Sabra.
Did she freeze on your end?
I can't hear her.
Okay, she's not moving or talking on mine either.
No, and she doesn't have the mute on either, so I think that her internet might have just gone slow or something. Oh, we lost her. She might come back soon.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Hey, everybody. Sabra is trying to get back on the internet. Can you all hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So just hang tight. I'm going to pull up something and try to help her out a little bit.
Okay.
But I don't have, I can't share a copy of the forms.
Can you email it?
Do you have a copy? Can you guys get on? Do you have access to zip forms?
I think so.
I'd have to look up how to do it. What form is it that we need?
The offer to purchase.
Okay.
And it's the 2022 version. There's Sabra.
Oh, sorry.
You're back.
Lost
Oh,
internet
good. I was just
connection.
about-
This is my internet connection is unstable. I said, I can tell that.
Okay,
my
so
land.
Sabra, I didn't get very much farther. I mean, I was just going to start out, and I can't share any documents with them through the phone.
I
So
just realized that. I thought, oh my gosh, it would be okay. Let's see if we can kick up. Thank you for Carla.
you're welcome.
Let's see. Hey Vince, how are you?
Yeah.
Hi, Sabra. I'm good.
Are we are we back on? Can you see the documents?
Go
Okay.
ahead.
Yes.
All right. All right. This is gonna be a hard offer to write, I tell you. All right. Let's see. Yes, my brain is confused right now. Where did we stop? we stopped at the due diligence fee, didn't we?
You just getting ready to explain this part.
Okay, all right, just make sure. The due diligence fee is so foreign to most buyers. You're going to have to spend a lot of time explaining it repeatedly. It's not going to be something you can say one time and anticipate that you're going to get it, because that means they're going to have to put some money down. They're going to have to, what they put skin in the game. They're going to have to put money down that they are risking losing. And most of us are very astute when it comes to looking at a scenario that we could lose money. But you have to help them to understand the right that they're getting. Terminating a contract is critical if you don't want to move forward. You don't want to be sued for specific performance. You don't want to be sued, period. And terminating the contract is a really big issue. Buyers don't necessarily think that's such a big issue. All right. They're more concerned about, am I going to lose my money? Am I going to get any money back? So for you to start trying to help them to understand the process of due diligence and why it's important to them. You know, buyers often will change their minds in 2 to 3 days after they write a contract. And sometimes they don't think they should pay a due diligence fee. Well, what you want to help them to understand is if they just change their mind, the seller gets the due diligence fee, but they get out of the contract and they don't have to move any further than paying the due diligence fee. There are times that you will have a really hard time and it might take a legal recourse to get the due diligence fee. But at least you can help them to understand the value to them is getting out of the contract for any or no reason. Maybe they found repair, during the process, they're going to find some inspection items that they had no idea about, the seller had no idea about, but the buyer says, I am not going to live with this condition. We recently had one with an encroachment, and then one with an easement for utilities that crossed the center of the property, not the house, but right next to the house. Well, nobody disclosed that to them. And when the buyers really found that out, they didn't want that house. They did not want a utility easement that close to their house. Well, that was found out during the due diligence process. They were able to get out of the contract and move on to another house. It did cost them, and I honestly don't remember the amount of money. It did cost them a few $1,000s because they put down a few $1,000s. When we first started doing our due diligence contract, and I think it was back in like 2011 or 12. I mean, it's been about 10 years. The due diligence, the ones that were training us or teaching us about due diligence were saying that a due diligence fee should be about a month's rent. If you're going to keep the house off the market for about a month, it's like renting the house for that month, and you're going to find out everything about, you have a right to do any inspections and all inspections. You definitely want to find out about the CCRs there. You want to find out if there's any special assessments. There's so many things to find out. So they suggested a month's rent. Well, in the last year, because of all the multiple offers we've gone in, I mean, the DDF amounts have gone through the roof. And sellers look at it as if the person who's going to put the most money on the line are the most serious and sincere about closing on the property.
Who sets the amount?
It's a negotiated amount. The buyer and the seller have to agree. There's not really a set amount. That's what I'm saying. They initially said it would be a month's rent, but that has gone out the window the last few months or a year. I am seeing those due diligence fees come down some. I don't know if Carla's still on here right now. If Carla, are you seeing those due diligence amounts coming down?
Yes, very much
Yeah.
so.
Very
Yeah.
much so. Because it was there. I can't tell you how many times we saw $100,000 going due diligence.
yeah.
I think, oh, good Lord, I cannot believe anybody would
Quite
risk
frequently.
$100,000. I mean, really, they weren't all $1 million properties. It was nothing to see $40,000. And I'm choking myself when I'm seeing this. But we are seeing that get a significant drop in that amount. So
Yeah.
an ordinary in a balanced market, you probably wouldn't see anywhere near. Well, you probably see more than the rental amount. But again, that's just the gauge. And I wish I could give you something more definite, but we're not giving anything more definite. It's strictly what the buyer is willing to put on the line, that if he wants the right to walk away for any or no reason, this is how much he's willing to walk away from.
40,000 is a lot to walk away from.
Lord, honey, I know it. I know it. I had a crazy friend who did that, and I said, "What are you doing?" But he said, "I want that house, and if it takes getting a high due diligence fee to get it, I'll deal with repairs afterwards. I want that house." And I said, "Well, you must want it better than I would." There are not too many houses I'd risk that much money. But again, it was the heat of the market. We have gone through such an intense 15 months, maybe 15, 16 months. And to get the house that they wanted, they were just risking so much. I don't see that happening in our next few months. We still may have some, but we won't be seeing that excessive amount. So that's the first thing you're going to have to talk to you. In a way, that's almost more important than the sales price, to be honest with you, because they've got to fork over that money right now. Okay. The day that you do the contract and the day that you make the offer and the day that it becomes a contract, which is called effective date, that's when the due diligence fee is due. The due diligence fee is in essence due with the contract. So if you'll notice right here, it's payable and deliverable to the seller by the effective date. So if the seller, and you probably have you've gotten it back from the seller in your e-signature program, then it's going to be up to you to get that money to the listing agent, and or if the listing agent, if you get it to them, then they can get it to the seller. We have been seeing that short-circuited considerably, whereas you see right here, there's different ways of getting the money. When we were dealing primarily with personal checks, which a lot of people don't even have anymore, we were dealing with cash or personal check or official bank check. In the last 2 years, they've added, that can be a wire transfer or it can be electronic transfer. Wire transfer, can you imagine, or can you see why? If somebody's going to put down $40,000, it would have to be a wire transfer. Okay. So it's the amount sometimes too, but it's the convenience of being able to do the wire transfer. The convenience of electronic transfer. The electronic transfer would be the Venmo, the PayPal, the Zelle. But keep in mind that those services have maximum amounts per day. And you could not send $40,000 electronically in one day. They don't, their maximums aren't anywhere near that. I think the maximum is, the highest was $5,000. So, so if for whatever reason, your client wants to send electronically, make sure that they know the ceiling or the amount that can be sent. Then if the seller accepts that service, then the seller can agree to that service. Now let me point on down, let's go down here just a minute. We'll come back to that, but I want to show you something. Oh, come on down. Well, okay, there he goes. Okay, see right here, this note on the top of the next page. If the parties agree that the buyer will pay any fee or deposit described above by electronic or wire transfer, the seller agrees to cooperate in effecting such transfer, including the establishment of any necessary account and providing any necessary information to the buyer, provided, however, the buyer shall be responsible for any additional costs. So if the buyer asks to be able to transfer the VDF to the seller, remember this is not to the tenant, this is to the seller, then the seller, if they agree, must have the account for the money to be transferred to. If they don't have Zelle or they don't have whatever, they've got to set it up or be willing to. Not very many people are willing to set it up, quite honestly. If they're not used to doing it that way, they're not willing to set it up. But just be aware that per the contract, if you have a contract, it's the seller's responsibility to make sure they can receive it. Okay. What we've seen more than the electronic transfer, particularly with these larger amounts, would be the wire transfer. But again, and I'm really cautious about this. Why would a seller want to give their account information, their routing information to someone they don't even know? They just got an offer on the property. But some sellers do, but because they know that's the way they're going to get the money. And so if they do, you cannot be transferring numbers. You don't give these amounts. This has to go person to person. And just like with a law office, when you do the earnest money, it has to be verbally conveyed with somebody that you know in that office. You've got to be very careful because we've had so much wire fraud. All right. So if for chance the seller does agree to accept a wire transfer, he's going to have to agree to be able to give his information to receive it. So enough on that. The earnest money. Initial earnest money. we have seen a change in this little block here this last time. In times, our previous versions, the earnest money was due within 3 days at one point, or within the number of days you put in the blank. Now they have specified it in black and white that the initial earnest money is due 5 days after the contract is signed, the effective date. All right. So again, you have the same options of how it's transferred. It can be cash. Oh, don't take cash. You can't put that on the copier and make copies of it. You know, that's illegal. And we need paper trails. So if you're going to get cash, go across 7-Eleven to get you some money orders, which we've also done. It can be a personal check, official bank check. You know what? It's amazing to me that a lot of people aren't even taking official bank checks right now, you know, because there's evidently has been so much fraud with that. So wire transfer again, electronic transfer within 5 days. Just be aware of that. So you as the buyer's agent have to keep the buyer on target, keep the focus that within 5 days, it has to be deposited. That question is, okay, where is it going to be deposited? Our firm doesn't, we don't maintain a trust account anymore. Most larger firms do not. A lot of firms, period, do not. The shift happened about 3 or 4 years ago, that it became prudent on all of our part to let an attorney handle the trust money, because that's what they do anyway. So now let me tell you where the money is going to have to go. Go down to page 2. It's called an escrow agent. The escrow agent is going to be the attorney that the buyer chooses to close the property. We call it settlement. It's going to be the attorney that holds the earnest money. DDF goes to the seller, and the buyer never sees that money again until he goes to closing and he sees a credit for it. The earnest money goes to the closing attorney. Initially, they may not know who they want to use as a closing attorney. You might want to suggest them, like I said a while ago, you might want to give them a list, but if they don't know, then I would suggest make it the most convenient to you, and I would go down the hall and make sure that they deposit the money, possibly with McNaughton Clements, because it's convenient. They can always choose to change the earnest money, transfer it to another attorney if that's what they want. Okay. But if you're just writing the offer and you're in a haste, then that would probably be the better thing to do. But just be aware, they do not have to stay with that attorney, although they typically do. All right. So the name that goes in here is going to be a law firm. And you might put the specific attorney, but by and large, it's going to be held by the law firm. All right. All right. Now back up here. And this has to be done within 5 days. The listing agent is going to be checking after 5 days to make sure, but you are responsible to make sure that it's in there. Now, let me show you a form. It's the last page back here, page 15, and it's called a receipt form. Oops, I went too far. There it is. Acknowledgement of receipt of monies. I mentioned to you when I go on the due diligence fee that it probably is the most prudent way, really, the easiest way for you to stay on top of it if they just give you the check and you get it to the seller. That seems to be the most efficient way. However, if you don't do it electronically, I would encourage you to do this. If it has to be done electronically, you're out of the picture. But if the buyer's agent has the check, the buyer's agent does not sign. The buyer's agent is responsible to get it to the listing agent, the listing firm, and the listing agent. If there is the listing agent's not available, and another licensed person in the firm can sign that they've received it. So if somebody comes into our front desk, Sue is not an agent, but Sue could call Carla, or and so then Carla could go sign for it. And that means we've got it, and then it's up, and then this receipt is gonna go back, it's gonna come back to, for you. And then beyond that, you don't have to worry about it because it's up to the listing firm, okay? Then again, the seller is going to, sign it if and when they get the check. I shouldn't say if, it's when they get the check. If you don't go through the firm, then you're gonna have to have the second one. The escrow agent, that's the attorney, right? We often don't have the attorney signing this form because of the electronically. So you can do an email that comes directly from the paralegal or someone in the law office, and that email will suffice for this receipt, because again, getting that receipt over there to them is not often the easiest thing to do. Now, you'll see there's a section here for additional earnest money. You rarely ever are going to have additional earnest money. But if you do, again, it's going to go to the attorney, and you're going to have to get the email or get this thing signed. Now let's scooch back on up here to, let's see if I can do it this way. On page 1, where we saw the DDF and the initial earnest money, there is a section for additional earnest money. There is a possibility that if for whatever reason they don't get their due diligence done during the due diligence period, and they want to extend it, the better way to extend it is to offer additional earnest money, because when your buyer closes, you get credit for the additional earnest money. You do not want to offer additional DDF, because that money is in the seller's pocket and you may or may not ever see it. You probably won't if it's DDF. So you're going to want the initial. If you do have additional earnest money, notice this right here. It has to be deposited no later than 5 p.m. on this date. And right here, see, time is the essence. Time is the essence is only 2 places in our North Carolina contract. This is one of them. The other place is the due diligence end date. And I'll show you that. See right here, the due diligence period is the period of time that the buyer and seller agree that the buyer can have the time to do the inspections and do whatever they need to do. Until this last year, it's been pretty standard or acceptable in the marketplace, about 3 weeks. 21 days has been very standard. Again, because of the speed of the market and the lack of inventory, that was one of the terms that sometimes buyers agents used to help sellers know that more quickly they could know that the buyer is proceeding to closing if they have a shorter period of time in the due diligence period. It's not unusual at all now. You'll see a 10-day due diligence period. But I've got to warn you, the inspectors and the appraisers can rarely get their work done within 10 days. They're overbooked, they're scheduled out. It's just hard to get someone to, it's not that they can't get it done, it's getting them to have the time to get out there and get it done. Some inspectors are saying they're working 7 days a week right now. Appraisers likewise. So as a buyer, the buyer wants to know that the house is in the condition, or they want to know that they've got repairs agreed upon. Do not miss what I just said. Repairs have to be agreed upon prior to 5 p.m. on the end date, or the buyer most likely is going to want to terminate, and you can't have it done after 5 p.m. 5 p.m. is a real critical. I often say it's 5 p.m. somewhere, but remember, it's 5 p.m. in North Carolina when it comes to this contract. All right. We had a buyer, it was in California, and he was very bent out of shape because he had to make his decision prior to 5 o'clock where he was. Well, North Carolina says it's in North Carolina. So if your buyer wants to terminate the contract, again, for any or no reason, they can terminate the contract but that termination has to be sent prior to 5 p.m. on the date that you list right here. And here's that other time being of the essence. Those are the two time of essence. That means at that point, the contract term expires and the seller no longer has to honor the fact that the buyer may want to terminate because the appraisal came in low, or they can't get financing, or their house didn't sell. This date right here is so critical. It's so critical to the buyers. And sadly enough, it's very difficult for the buyers when the seller doesn't agree to this particular date, okay? Because obviously the buyers would like it to go to 2 days before closing. Can you see why? You know, because if they don't get their financing or something happens, they'd like it to go right up to closing or 2 days before. A seller's not going to accept that. You know, so again, you've got your hands full negotiating that period of time, which is comfortable at 21 days, but anywhere around that that you can get agreement is that's what you're going to have to do. Let me tell you this, if for whatever reason the buyer does want to terminate, you would use the form 350. And that is a termination of contract by notice from the buyer to the seller. It's a notice to the seller. And when you send a notice, that is a unilateral termination. So when your buyer signs it and you send that to the seller, the contract is terminated. It's unilateral. It doesn't have to have an agreement by the seller. The contract is terminated. You must have record that you have sent it 3 minutes before 5 p.m. For years, we were under the understanding that the listing agent would have had to receive it and notify the seller. About a year or so ago, the attorneys made a different ruling, and now the ruling is you have to show, you as the buyer's agent would have to show that you initiated or you sent that to the listing agent, who then could obviously contact the seller. But that was kind of an interesting a point that was clarified and changed for us if you are going to terminate. And I already mentioned, if you're not going to terminate, you got to have an agreement already signed. The agreement is called due diligence request. That due diligence request is where you're going to write down all the things that the buyer wants fixed. The seller is going to respond if they're going to fix anything, or if they maybe give you some money in lieu of fixing those things. But the key is having it agreed to prior to 5 p.m., allowing you enough time to get the termination out of your inbox out on its way so that the buyer doesn't lose his right to terminate if he can't agree. Okay. The things on the due diligence request, there are times that you will come to terms on an amount of money. The amount of money might be something said in lieu of repairs. Seller agrees to pay $5,000 to buyer at closing, and that needs to be transferred to a form called agreement to amend. And again, when we talk about this at the end of the month on that termination class, I'll go in more details. But just be aware that that form must be executed between the buyer and the seller. Now let's scooch back on up here just a moment. When you are putting an amount of money in here, you're choosing the way it's going to be transferred. An amount of money should go in here as initial earnest money. We have also seen this past year a high amount in due diligence fee and zero in earnest money. Whereas for times past, you might see a very low due diligence and a high earnest money. Just be aware that you might see that too. So this column is arithmetic, okay? This doesn't have anything to do with the loan. All you're putting here is the sales price. It's going to be minus the due diligence fee, because that's going to be money already paid up front. It's going to be minus the initial earnest money. And right now, you probably are not going to specify additional. So it's going to be a plus here, minus due diligence, minus initial earnest money. And these are going to be zeros all the way down and come down here. And this is just going to be the balance of your plus and your two minuses. Again, it's arithmetic. It has nothing to do with your loans. Okay, now look at this paragraph right here. This paragraph basically says that if the buyer fails to deliver the due diligence fee and or the earnest money, the seller has a right now to have a unilateral termination. This is the only place in the contract a seller can terminate before the end of the contract. All right. Well, look at your little friend. He's not so little. He wants to learn about.
Yeah, they want to go out.
Hurry back.
Give me a minute.
Hurry back. A seller does not have a right to terminate in this contract. All right. The buyer has all the right because the buyer's put the money on the table. The buyer has a right to terminate only within that period of time that they agreed to, that we just talked about. Now, if they don't pay for that right, then the seller has a right to demand that they do send either or both. And they're going to send as a form numbers 355. The seller sends the form 355, which is a notice to the buyer that if they do not deliver within 1 business day these fees, then the seller will have the option to cancel the contract or terminate the contract. If the buyer does not pay within that 24-hour or that business day, then the seller may or may not choose to send over their unilateral termination. And that's form 352. That's the termination of contracts by the seller when notice to the buyer. So the buyer, when terminated, is form 350. The termination from the seller is 352. If your buyer gets, or you get that form, that means the contract is terminated, it's done. That doesn't mean that the seller does not still have the right to take the buyer to court for the earnest money. The earnest money, if they go to small claims court, can be settled in small claims court if the earnest money is $10,000 or less. As we've talked about a few minutes ago, sometimes those earnest monies are much higher than that. So then it has to go to civil court. And yes, we've dealt with a number of these. Sometimes the seller just says, you know what, it's not worth my time to go to, spend a day down at the court. I'm just going to get on and take another offer, and they'll kind of back down. But don't be surprised, some of them will not back down. So know that earnest money is spelled out in our contract. The seller in our contract agrees, and per the contract, if they are paid the due diligence fee and the earnest money per the contract, they accept that amount as liquidated damages, and they cannot sue for specific performance. That's the term of the contract. The due diligence and the earnest money satisfy as liquidated damages, and the seller cannot sue. If that's not satisfactory to the seller, then the seller would have the right to sue for specific performance. So you better make sure that the buyer understands that. Now, on the back of this, again, it's number 23, and it's right at the end of the contract on page 12, maybe it's 13 now. Remedies is what you're looking for. Oops, there it is, number 23. This was added to the contract last year and expounded on this year. Be sure that you understand if there's a breach by the buyer or a breach by the seller, what the remedies they have. All right. So the buyer just needs to know they need to go ahead and pay their due diligence fee. You deliver it to the seller. within the 24-hour period, and preferably the day that you actually do the signatures on the contract. Now let's go back up here to page 2, or maybe we're ready to go 3. You just didn't know we were going to camp out so long, but let me tell you, those first 2 pages, that's the meat right there. That's the meat. If your buyers want to see definitions of some of these dates, some of these terms you're using, the effective date here is, there's a description or a definition of effective date. Due diligence, here's the definition of the due diligence. The due diligence fee is right in here. Here's your due diligence period. They're gonna hear you use these terms, and sometimes it's really good just to point out black and white. You know, that's why I like to sit with my buyers and go through some of these things. But if you go through it with them, you can still go back to the office and put the forms in your e-signature program, or you can learn how to sign in person. But it's very effective when you help them to understand what you're talking about when you use these terms. Now let's look at this right here. When we've now gone through the due diligence period, we're going to go on to what's called settlement. Oh my gosh, it's I have a hard time saying settlement because I've spent so many years calling it closing. In North Carolina, closing doesn't happen until 4 things have happened. In fact, you can see right here, here's a settlement date, and closing. In North Carolina, we have a time that we sit down at a table, which I call a closing table, but it's actually the settlement table. The buyer signs away their life with the loan. The buyer forks over the money or has it wired in. The seller doesn't give the keys. That's just called settlement. And the buyer said, well, wait a minute, I just gave you all my money. How come I can't have the keys? Or how come I don't own the house? Because there are 4 things that have to happen in North Carolina, and they're itemized right here. You have the settlement, and most of the time it's done in an attorney's office. Well, I guess you've probably been seeing the possibility that we might be doing e-closings in the near future. That's a possibility. There are some people who actually do the settlement in the parking lot with a notary. That has as a product of COVID, but most of the time you're going to go to the attorney's office. That's called settlement. The attorney is the settlement agent. He's not an attorney representing either party. Although the buyer chooses the attorney is a settlement agent. Now, the settlement date, the date you're going to go to the attorney's office, is going to be inserted right here. That date, please don't make it the very last day of the month. That is just, you want a zoo experience. Just go right ahead and have the last day of the month is closing. You don't want to do that. A good day to close is Thursday. They don't have, attorneys don't do a lot of refinances on Thursday. You're going to have a little less conflict on the scheduling on Thursday. So just keep in mind the Thursday before the last day of the month might be a good possibility. It's totally up to the buyer. You know, you can kind of give some guidance, but it's totally up to the buyer. And then once obviously you present your offer, it has to be agreed to by the seller. But by and large, it's what's agreeable to the buyer, what day they're going to be in town, and you know, when they're moving here. So the 4 things of the settlement, one final title review by the attorney. Because yes, sometimes between the time they do the title work early on and the day you're going to have settlement, there could be another lien that has snipped in there. Sometimes it's a tax lien, sometimes it's some other lien, but more likely a tax lien. So you're going to have the title search again, final title search. You're going to have the release of the funds, obviously until the funds are released by the lender. According to the closing documents, the attorney can't close it. Then the attorney has to register at the Register of Deeds. The deed has to be registered, and that's the final step. Then you can consider it closed. That's not the way most buyers understand it, and that doesn't feel right, but that's the way it's done in North Carolina. settlement, final title search, release of funds, and recording of the deed. Once the attorney confirms to the listing agent that the deed has been recorded, that's when the listing agent and seller will release the keys. This sometimes is a source of contention. Sometimes you have to negotiate that. You might want to work with both agents, be aware that the keys can be an issue. They're not going to get the keys at the settlement table, rarely, if ever, but at least discuss it ahead of time so that both parties can be aware of it. All right. And y'all come to terms as to how you're going to do the keys. Attorneys do not want to hold the keys. The attorneys do not want the buyer to come back to the attorney's office to pick up the keys. So again, this is just one of those little technicalities that you all kind of have to work through. Let's close right here. You see, we talked about this last week, the red versus the blue boxes, the red boxes being a warning box versus just a pay attention note here. Here you got the warning. In North Carolina, we are an attorney state, and so is South Carolina. The attorneys are the ones who do the closings. We do not do closings with title companies. I came up here from Florida many years ago, and I didn't know about going to an attorney because we never pulled an attorney in unless there was a problem. The title companies close it. There's a lot of states that have a title company, but in North Carolina, it's an attorney state. An attorney it should be doing it, and they're warning in this paragraph right here that they should be using an attorney. There's sometimes you're dealing with an investor that might be using the title company, but again, that's an exception to the rule. All right. Special assessments. This has become a real big issue this past year, well, more so last year. Special assessments, those are assessments that have been, it's like a lien that's put on the property. The seller is going to be responsible for paying off that special assessment before closing or at closing, before the buyer becomes the owner. The buyer does not assume a special assessment. There's some other paragraphs. We'll talk about that as well. That's one of those things that the buyer has to find out about during due diligence. The buyer is responsible, but guess who they're going to be looking to find that out? It's going to be you as a buyer's agent. So you're going to have to find out too, but it's a buyer's responsibility. Okay. Let's go down here. You will recognize that list. It looks just like the one in the listing agreement, doesn't it? This is the list of things that the buyer is anticipating being attached to the property and therefore being left in the property. Again, I think we talked about it considerably as for like the she shed, and we talked about the security system. I've heard some good things about the security systems recently, which I was really surprised. I heard just recently that CPI is not charging a transfer fee. And I went, whoa, I kind of like that. So if the seller owns, if the seller has a service contract, you need to find out. If they have a service contract, you need to find out if there is a transfer fee, or find out if your buyer can have their own company come in. Then the seller needs to be responsible for paying off any penalty for getting out of their contract and service. All right. It's important that you spend time with the buyer on this, because there are a number of things that the buyer might have a question on. To spend time so they know what they're buying. They're not just buying the 4 walls. They are buying a number of these things. The unpairing of data we talked about. Jonathan was nice enough to kind of give us some extra insight on pairing and unpairing. The items that are leased or not owned, that are not owned, very, very rarely now are any satellite dishes being moved. These security systems are built into the house. The things that you're most likely going to have something like that would be a propane tank, and that's a whole different section now. So we'll look at that in a moment. That was what Carla found the other day, that wasn't checked. Go Carla.
the NC rec, I watched the video saying they had new, laws regarding the propane tanks and how much fuel is in it, and before it used to be with, they would pay the owners, buyers would pay the owners, and now they have to just leave it in there and stuff.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about, the fuel tank. You're exactly right. Now the seller cannot sell that fuel. Up until this particular version of the contract, the seller could. Now they can't. Now the
Okay.
seller has to leave the fuel in there. They can use every bit of it. All
Up
right.
until closing, up until
Uh-huh.
settlement.
But they have to leave it on.
Yeah.
You remember that. That's good.
Yeah, well, I watched the video saying that there was new laws that went into effect this
Good.
year. and stuff like
Uh-huh.
that.
Good. Well, those videos help, don't they?
Yes.
Well, we're all still learning about this fuel tank because it's clarified, but the clarification is different from what we had been taught earlier. So thank you for sharing that. That's really good. Items that would not convey. Sometimes a seller does not want to leave their favorite rose bush, or they may choose not to leave the TV mount. They may choose not to convey that. If for whatever reason they put in the listing agreement, but your buyer says, hey, I don't want you to move that and destroy my wall and fix it back, they can ask for it. Okay. Now, personal property right here, personal property. I want to remind you that if the listing includes a refrigerator, a washer, or a dryer, that is personal property. It is offered to a buyer. It is not guaranteed that it's going to be there unless the buyer's agent writes it in the contract. Right here is where you would write it. The buyer's agent needs to remember and remind the buyer that if they want the refrigerator and washer dryer, if they want it, those are the three things that typically would be put in there. You're not going to put the antique bedroom set. You're not going to put the patio set. Lenders do not want to see that because they're going to say, you're saying it's of no value, but we know that you are considering it of value because you're asking for it. So those things will be done just like selling on Craigslist or selling in Marketplace. That's going to be something outside of the contract if they sell personal property. However, you could put refrigerator, washer, and dryer. If it's offered in MLS, you got to write it in the contract or it doesn't have to stay. Okay. Where this is a warning about due diligence. We've already talked about that. We've talked a lot about the warning, but they put it in the red box in the contract itself so that the buyers see it in the big red box that all the things they're supposed to do during due diligence. They must do that during the due diligence period. And right here, look at this. It's capital. Sometimes I think they ought to put it in red. Seller is not obligated to grant an extension, even though your buyer needs the extension. And it may be the difference in your client, your buyer being able to get the loan or maybe to get some of his inspections done. The seller is not obligated to do any repairs. It's been sold in its current condition, and the buyer is not obligated to grant an extension or to make the repair. So just keep that in mind. All right. The property, obviously the buyer is going to get their loan. This is all the investigation. Look at all those things that the buyer needs to be doing during the due diligence period. Yes, you're going to be helping them with a lot of this. If you're going to be helping these, like to order the inspections or to order the survey or to advise on the title insurance, that form of, I can't remember now if I talked about it earlier, but the professional services disclosure and election, I did mention it before. That's a worksheet. It's an organic worksheet. You start right from the very beginning with that list of inspections that they may want. Pull that professional services disclosure out. And I hope you've already given them the sample of the professional services disclosure, but at least pull it out now and start, like I say, start working on your plan of the investigations that the buyer wants. You don't have to settle it right at this point, but you have that to the side so that they know that you are going to help them go through all these inspections. All right. You're going to talk to them about the documents. Remember those CCRs we talked about, the residential property disclosure, the MOG. Hopefully they're on your listing. If not, you're going to get those CCRs for them or with them so that they can have a review. Don't wait until the day before closing, get CCRs. I got a story on that too, but I won't do it because I got to get on with the contract. Make sure that what your buyer needs, if your buyer is a person who has a company truck, and on the company truck it has the, you know, the logo branding or whatever, there's some neighborhoods that you can't park that in the driveway. All right. If your buyer needs that, you've got to be aware of that and caution your buyer to read the CCRs, and you read the CCRs to make sure, because you know they have a work truck. All right. There are a lot of other, you know, if they have dogs. Looks like Jonathan has a pretty little puppy there, but he's not little. He needs a big privacy fence. So if he's in a neighborhood that'll only allow 4-foot privacy fences, he's gonna be in trouble. Okay. So make sure that those are just some of the things you want to look for, the CCRs. Insurance. Homeowners insurance can't be ordered on a dime anymore. Used to, we could have I can still see myself going to a closing. It was over in Anson County and ordering that insurance as we're driving over there for a closing. And I'm thinking that was a stupid thing, but we could do it back then. We could get a binder in 2 hours. No longer. It's taking sometimes 10 days to 2 weeks to get your homeowner's insurance settled. There are some companies or some people that'll help you quicker. I'm not saying it's always going to take, but prepare your buyer to start working on the insurance. Appraisals, you know, you need to allow plenty of time for the appraisals. The same things with a survey. All of these things right in here are things that you are going to assist the buyer, but it's the buyer's responsibility. Last week, we talked about the streets and the roads, the private road maintenance agreements, right? Special assessments, again, it's alluded right here is where it says the buyer is responsible to find out about special assessments. Now, we do not have anything called a contingency for the sale of a buyer's property in another area or anywhere. We used to have a contingency addendum that would allow a buyer, if they did not sell their property wherever else it was, they could get out of the contract, the one that you'll be writing. That is not an option in North Carolina. The buyer is going to have to use the due diligence date to manage that. If the buyer's house is under contract, the buyers most likely want to know that it's closing or closed before the end of due diligence. So you're going to have to manage that due diligence. If you have to have a longer period of due diligence, guess what that means? That means more money in due diligence fee because the buyer's asking for a longer period. There is a correlation of the time frame that the buyer is buying for the right to be able to walk away for any and no reason. So there will be a correlation in there of how much money that the seller is going to accept. But just know that there is no contingency. And sometimes people will say they can't get the loan anyway if they can't sell that other house. And that's true for a lot of people. And that's why the contingency addendum was so popular. But North Carolina says you've got to manage that within the due diligence. That's one of those periods of one of those situations where the additional earnest money might come into play. You know, if that house hasn't closed or there maybe it didn't close and they put it back on the market, that's where you could come back in with some additional earnest money and possibly get an extension. But again, the seller is not required, but that's would be something you might negotiate with. Okay. And right here, they did put it in capital. Again, I think it should be in red. This property is being sold in its current condition. The seller may, but is not required to engage in negotiations for repairs and improvements to the property. There is not a buyer alive that doesn't think the seller is going to negotiate in repairs. Have we not seen it in the last year to 18 months? Sellers say, I'm gonna make any repairs. Sometimes they won't even negotiate on it, but the negotiation is they come back and say, seller to make no repairs. And they've been able to sell their hot properties. I don't see that being the norm going forward, but there will be more negotiations going on. If for whatever reason they need to terminate, here again is it's stated in black and white, provided that the buyer has delivered any agreed upon due diligence fee. And that was addition to this particular version. Provided that the buyer has delivered any agreed upon due diligence fee on page 1, the buyer shall have the right to terminate this contract for any reason or no reason. You want to highlight that and stress that by delivering to the seller a written notice. And we talked about that. Again, that's that time is the essence at 5 p.m. on the end date of the due diligence period. Okay. We often use this phrase right here. Closing shall constitute acceptance of the property in its then existing conditions, unless provision is otherwise made in writing. When the buyer goes to settlement and they accept that property, they sign off on it, they bought that property. This is not something you go back on the seller unless it's most of the time it's going to be a legal thing, quite honestly. Sometimes you can work out something afterwards, but typically it means the buyer has bought the property at that time, unless you've worked out something at closing where something's going to be, sometimes windows don't come in and you have to have them installed later. There sometimes, like I had one not too long ago, a septic tank had to be installed and they couldn't be installed before closing. So you work it out in writing if there's something different. This section here has to do with how the buyer is going to buy the property. Is the buyer going to pay cash? If the buyer is going to be paying cash, you might as well get it ready. It's called a proof of funds. You're going to have to provide documentation that the buyer does indeed have those funds to be able to close. A listing agent, prudent listing agent, or a seller is not going to just take their word for it. So you're going to have something in writing that is, and the listing agent is going to ask for proof of funds. Now, look right here. There's one of those check marks. The proof of funds verification is what it's called, is or is not attached. If it is attached, obviously you want to check it. If it's not, the listing agent is going to say, where is it? When are you going to give it to me? You know, because the seller is probably not going to make a decision until he sees it. Now, this section right here is the type of loan that the buyer anticipates getting. It is not contingent upon any financing. This, what you spell out here, or anything else. This contract is managed only by the due diligence end date. That's the due diligence period end date. That's the only thing you can manage. The loan that you put in here is information for the seller, that the seller is going to be more comfortable with this loan than there might be another loan that might be presented by another buyer. So if you've got a buyer that's going to get an FHA 3.5% down, that seller might not feel that's as strong as an offer as someone who's going to put 20% down. I'm just making a comment, okay? I'm not saying that he should or he shouldn't, but he has the seller has a right to know what money is going to be put down to make his own estimation as to how strong the buyer is. The important thing to your buyer is it's not contingent upon that particular loan. Right here, I just talked about having another property for sale. All you're going to do is identify if there is another property for sale. You're not making it contingent. You're just making the seller aware if there is. Let's go down here. The residential property disclosure, do not check that the buyer has it if the buyer doesn't have it. If it's not available with the listing and you can't get a copy of the listing agreement listing agent, when you present this, go ahead and check this, that they haven't received it. All right. When they do receive it, you do not have to go back and check this or alter this. The date that the buyer signs on the residential property disclosure will supersede this date. So that's why you don't have to go back and change it. So if they don't have it, you're going to get it to them within 3 days and they're going to sign it, and that will supersede this. But the main thing is just don't say you have it if you don't. All right. You'd be surprised how many times we've had to answer that question. The buyer's obligation, these are the costs that the buyer is going to incur. You rarely do a cost sheet or net sheet for a buyer. The loan lender is going to do that. Now, if it's a cash buyer, you might do a net sheet, and the net sheets that you find in Canopy are quite good. That's one of the categories in Canopy that you can pull out some of these formatted net sheets, and they are quite good. If you're a listing agent, you definitely want to use a net sheet. For the buyers, you generally are going to rely on the lender because there are so many different costs. We couldn't keep up with all those. So make sure that the buyer has that. The seller represents, these are things that you want to go through mainly so that you know, and all the answers to these questions, these checkbox should be in the listing agreement, because these are the things that the seller is representing that he's giving or he's responsible for. So he knows the cost that he's going to be incurring to close. All of these things are things that the seller should be making available. And if not, then you're going to be questioning where is that CCR or those deed restrictions if they're not on the listing agreement. There's your homeowners, and there's the fuel tank that we were just talking about. They have made the entire section now about fuel tanks, which we've never had. And right here, Ms. Paula's going to get you if you don't check that there is or is not a fuel tank. The thing that you're going to see most is the fuel tank for propane gas for gas logs. You're going to see that more than any other fuel tank. But make sure that even for that you've checked it. And we won't talk anymore about that. But your obligations here from the seller obviously is obligated to provide a clear title. I told you a while ago there was only one way a seller could terminate a contract up until closing. This is the one way the seller can breach a contract. If the clear title cannot be conveyed, that's a breach of title. And in that situation, although the seller may or may not have known about it, if they cannot convey clear title, the buyer is entitled to a refund of the DDF, a refund or release of the earnest money, and all costs can be reimbursed for any of the inspections and the costs that the buyer incurred as they did their due diligence. So it could be pretty serious at that point. But why should the buyer have to pay for the seller's not being able to convey? So that's what the form writers have put in here for us. So just know that the title has to be clear. The payoff has to be taken care of, so there's no liens that go on, obviously. That is the one thing that could be considered a breach by the seller. Access to the property, you want to make sure that the buyer knows that they're going to have a right to go into the property or with the inspectors. Oh, when I said that, you as a buyer's agent, do not let your buyers go to the property with an inspector unless you are there. Those buyers should never be in that property with only the inspector. You are responsible to have them access that property. You're responsible to watch what's going on when they are in that property. The inspector is not. The inspector is hired to do an inspection, not to babysit the buyers, all right? So make sure that you're the one that makes the appointment, you're the one that accesses that lockbox, and you be there with the buyer when the buyer's there. Okay. This is another point here, removal of seller's property. Somebody said, well, there's nowhere in the contract that says that the seller has to be out by closing. Oh, really? What about this paragraph? Okay, it says the seller shall remove by the date possession is made available to the buyer, which would be closing, and or if the buyer possesses the property before closing with that document, the agreement, then the buyer, the seller will be out at that time. So you want the seller to be aware. There are some states that the sellers do not have to move out for 2 or 3 weeks or even a month after closing. And so help your seller to help the listing agent to know that the buyer expects to take possession and the house needs to be cleared. Again, we've got good title and legal access here. The general warranty deed. Sometimes properties, particularly a brand new construction home, the buyer will get a special warranty deed on new construction. But when that buyer turns to sell it, it becomes a general warranty deed. All right. So they may not see, if it's new construction, it won't say general warranty, but just so you're aware of the difference there. I'm not going to go through too much more of this because we're out of time, but let me, if you will, give me a couple more minutes. The agreement to buy, to pay for buyer's expenses. We have not seen very much of this recently, but I think you will begin to see it again, where buyers are basically financing their closing costs. You will see sometimes, and often you'll see it in a FHA or a VA situation where the buyers just might not have saved enough money to put a large down payment, but they have enough money that they can do the 3.5% down, or a VA, VA loan is 0 down. And so sometimes they will ask the seller to pay for the closing costs. When they ask for the seller to pay closing costs, that is in essence them financing the closing costs because they're having to pay a little bit higher price for it. All right. But it facilitates them being able to buy the house. So they may ask for, let's say, $3,500 or $4,500. As a buyer's agent, you be very careful to talk to the lender and get a good estimate of what those closing costs are going to be. If those closing costs are going to be, let's say, $3,500 and you're asking for $4,500, guess who gets the overage? The seller. Because if you are going to contribute $4,500 for closing costs, the closing costs don't amount to that much money. That much money is going to go back to the seller. Just be aware of that. Sometimes agents think that sometimes they'll give a concession. Sometimes agents say, well, I'll contribute, let's say $5,000 toward the buyer's closing costs. Don't recommend it, but it happens sometimes. If the buyer doesn't use it, that money goes back to the seller, even though it was the agent who gave it. Okay, so because this contract is between the buyer and the seller. So just be cautious of how much money you're asking for and how much you agreed to on this. That's the only thing I'm going to make you aware of. Look here, payment of special assessments. Remember I mentioned that twice already this morning or this afternoon. Special assessments, look here. Seller shall pay in full at settlement all special assessments that are approved prior to settlement. When there's an assessment that your HOA puts into effect, it could have been after you did the contract, but before settlement. The seller is still going to be responsible for that. Okay, so just make sure that you understand that paragraph right there, because that's important to your buyer. And it's especially important to the seller. Okay, home warranties, we're not going to talk about that. this is a new section in our contract, and I think it's good because they've itemized some of these things and made it they've simplified it easier for us to understand the charges by the owners association. Just go through those and identify those and be clear with your buyer as to what the buyer is going to have to pay. Okay. Prorations and adjustments, that is not new. Conditions of property risk of loss if the house burns. And in my 40 years, I think I've only had 2 different scenarios where the houses were damaged to the point that they could not be moved into, and so we have had that. And generally, that's the buyer walks away. There's very few times to the extent of that loss, the buyer doesn't go ahead and take their money, their due diligence and everything back and move on. Unless it's someone who has the capabilities of doing the general contract and to fix it. So just make sure that is one of the things that, again, don't spend a lot of time on it, just be aware of it. Now, this delayed settlement, every now and then you get to the settlement date, or maybe 3 days before, 2 days before, and the lender is going to say, we can't, there's no way we're going to get this closed. The appraisal's not back, the title work's not clear, something is stalling it. This contract allows 7 days to clear whatever it is. You don't have to do any extended paperwork. It's already built in the contract. What you do have to do is communicate with that listing agent. You as a buyer's agent, if you know there's a problem with the loan of the lender that's going to delay something, then it's the ethical thing to do and the legal thing to do to communicate that so that the listing agent and the seller can adjust to the degree they can. Sometimes the seller's already moved out, and that's not an easy thing to deal with, but it's the prudent thing to do. Or as early on as you know, go ahead and explain that or express what the issue is to the listing agent so that they can make arrangements to know that they're not going to be able to close, let's say for 3 days or 4 days. The contract only allows up to 7 days. All right. If by the 7th day, you're still not ready to close, then you're going to use a form called agreement to amend and ask for an extension for whatever period it is. When that period is listed on that agreement to amend, an additional 7 days comes into play. So if you're supposed to close on September the 30th, you get close to October the 6th or 5th, 6th, make sure if you are going to put another closing date, that new date will have another 7-day period unless you check a box saying it's only going to be 4 days. It's a second 7 days unless you check the box on that agreement to amend to only allow 4 days. Just don't get caught on that, because a lot of times the sellers think it's a time of the essence date and you're going to close on that date. Just watch that extension. Then you've got, obviously you got your extension, the additions. We're not going to be talking about that. I was seeing if there was anything else that we really needed to look at this right here, computation of days and time. Our contract is based upon calendar days. Unless it specifies a business day, all days are calculated on calendar days. And those days, if you say 10 days, the number, it starts counting tomorrow, not today. Today is not a part of 10 days. Tomorrow will be the day 1, and it would go 10 days, no exceptions on Labor Day weekend, which we just really, I recently had the question on that, holidays or weekends. All right. And again, here's the remedies we talked about before. You'll want to make sure that you get your signatures on for your buyer. And if your buyer is buying under the auspice of an LLC, corporation, partnership, trust, then they sign down here. They do not sign up here. You're going to come fill in the name of the trust or the estate or whatever right here. This is the signature line for your buyer. This is your buyer's printed name. This is their title, whether it's trustee or manager or whatever, or president, whatever title. And then you put your date here. And don't forget to go through your wire fraud warning. Oh my goodness, please don't forget that. And this is the sheet where you're going to tell the listing agent, excuse me, you're going to tell the listing agent to contact you if there's any issue. If they want to give you a notice of any kind, it's going to come to you as the selling firm, as the selling agent. And whoops, where'd it go? I lost it. But you're going to, right here's where your name's going to be. The listing agent is going to be here. You are not going to put information up here for the seller or buyer. We do not want contact going between agent and our client. So you're not going to put anything in here. You're going to only put your information here as a selling agent. And yes, what you know from the MLS, put listing information here. The attorneys appreciate it. Yes, sir.
What if you're either the buyer or the seller of a property as an agent? Would you be in both spots?
No, you still don't. You're still not gonna put yourself as a buyer agent, because you still don't want the listing agent contacting you as an agent. Obviously, they know you're an agent, but you still wouldn't put your information in there.
Like a seller, let's say you're selling a property.
Okay, you're selling the property. Okay, it's the same
Okay.
thing. If you're selling the property, your information is going to be listed right here. There's no reason for, and so you might not want them knowing a mailing address. You would want them to mail it to the office. You see,
Even if the property is yours?
even if the property is yours, why would you want them to mail it? Why would you want
Okay.
them to mail it to your home?
Okay, yeah, okay.
See, you see what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
So I would rarely, in fact, I don't know any situation where I would put information here or here.
Okay.
This should have, and because if you're the seller, they've got enough information right here.
Okay.
Okay. And here's a receipt of monies is right there. So now your additional provisions addendum, we talked about that at the end. You might want to look at that. I will go ahead and send all this packet of information. I've kept you 15 minutes too long, but thank you again. Thank you again for us working through our technology issues. But you know my email and you know my telephone number, and I'm going to send these out to you a little bit later. I'll email them to you. And if you've got some questions, call Carla.
Hey,
She can definitely give you the answers, but you know I'm here for you too. Thank you so much for being with me today. I've loved being with you as
Okay.
always. And you
Thank
have a
you
good
very much,
day.
thank
Saber.
you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you, Carla.
Bye.
Have a good
Bye.
one.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.